1678 BCE, southern Mesopotamia. You are a farmer. You stand before a scribe in the temple courtyard. His reed stylus hovers over wet clay. You cannot read. You cannot verify what he writes. But you know what this moment means. 12 shekels of silver, borrowed 6 months ago to buy seed barley. The contract says you repay after harvest. But harvest is not measured by the ripeness of grain, not by your judgment, not by the feel of the wheat in your hands. Harvest is measured by a date carved into clay, a date determined by priests watching the moon from ziggurats 40 miles away. Priests you have never met, calculating dates you cannot verify, using knowledge you do not possess. The scribe presses his cylinder seal into the clay. The tablet hardens. Your fate is permanent now. Written, legal, unchallengeable. The calendar says your debt is due in 3 weeks. The calendar, you have learned, is never wrong. Your land, 3 generations in your family, will be forfeit by the next new moon. Your hand trembles, not from fear of the debt. You have been in debt before, from fear of the calendar, because the calendar is not yours. It belongs to them, the priests, the scribes, the temple, and what they control is not just time. They control when you work, when you eat, when you owe, when you lose everything. This is not a story about astronomy. This is a story about power. For more than 3,000 years, across the river valleys and highland plateaus of the ancient Near East, calendars were not merely tools for tracking time. They were weapons, instruments of control, mechanisms through which kings, priests, and creditors regulated labor, extracted wealth, and enforced obedience. To control the calendar was to control everything. When debts came due, when taxes must be paid, when fields could be planted, when festivals must be observed, when the gods themselves demanded sacrifice. The calendar determined who worked and who rested, who ate and who went hungry, who prospered and who fell into servitude. It was in the hands of those who maintained it, among the most powerful technologies of social organization ever devised. And it worked. Not through violence, not through armies, through something more insidious, through time itself weaponized. This is the story of how that power was built, wielded, and occasionally shattered. It begins not with kings or temples. It begins with farmers like you, watching the sky, trying to survive. You need to know when to plant. Too early, and late frosts kill the sprouting grain. Too late, and the crop withers in brutal summer heat before the kernels can fill. The margin for error is vanishingly small. In the rain-fed highlands of northern Mesopotamia, wheat must be sown within a window of perhaps 3 weeks in late autumn. Miss that window, and your family starves. The sky offers answers. The Pleiades, rising in late spring, signal summer's beginning. Sirius, appearing in midsummer, warns of the year's hottest days. But stars alone are insufficient. They drift slowly against the seasons. Their cycles do not quite match the solar year. What you need is something you can see every night. The moon. The lunar cycle is immediate, obvious. 29 or 30 days from new moon to new moon. 12 or 13 lunar months in a solar year. You can count moons. You remember that barley should be planted on the 2nd moon after the autumn equinox. That lambs will be born 3 moons later. That harvest comes when the 6th moon wanes. The lunar calendar emerges not from sophistication, from necessity, from the need to impose rhythm on the chaos of seasons and weather. But the lunar calendar has a fatal flaw. 12 lunar months total, only 354 days. The solar year, the true measure of seasons, runs 365. Every year, the lunar calendar falls 11 days behind the sun. After 3 years, the discrepancy approaches a full month. If left uncorrected, the calendar drifts hopelessly out of sync. The second month arrives when it should be the third, then the fourth, then the fifth. Planting dates become meaningless. The calendar fails. The solution is intercalation, the periodic addition of an extra month to realign the lunar calendar with the solar year. But who decides when to add that month? And how is that decision communicated across hundreds of villages and dozens of city-states, each with its own local traditions? The answer emerges slowly across centuries as political power consolidates in the river valleys. The priests decide. And the decision is not merely technical. Think about that. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, the great Sumerian city-states have developed sophisticated bureaucracies centered on temple complexes. These temples are not merely religious centers. They are economic engines, controlling vast estates, employing thousands of workers, managing flocks and herds, storing grain in massive warehouses, financing trade expeditions reaching the Indus Valley and Anatolia. The temples need precise record-keeping. They need to track labor obligations, calculate rations, schedule festivals, and above all, manage credit. Credit is the lifeblood of Mesopotamian agriculture. You borrow seed grain in spring. You repay with interest after harvest. Merchants borrow silver to finance expeditions. They repay when goods return. Laborers borrow food during lean months. They work it off during planting or harvest. Every loan requires a contract, specifying the amount borrowed, the interest rate, and the date of repayment. That date is measured in months and years according to the calendar maintained by the temples. The priests who manage the calendar thus manage the economy. They decide when the year will have 12 months, when it will have 13. They decide which month will be doubled in an intercalated year. They decide when debts come due, and they make these decisions in private, through procedures known only to the initiated, based on astronomical observations conducted from temple ziggurats where no commoner can go. Today, we call it insider trading. The principle is identical. Those with knowledge profit. Those without knowledge pay. 2217 BCE. The city of Umma. Two rival scribal families serving different temples have been locked in dispute for 3 months. The question: does the current year require an intercalary month? One family cites observations of Sirius and the Pleiades. They argue the 13th month is necessary to prevent calendar drift. The other points to different star risings and Euphrates flood patterns. They insist 12 months suffices. The city's ruler lacks astronomical expertise. He sides with the more politically connected family. No intercalary month is declared. The barley harvest arrives 3 weeks early that year, as it always does when the calendar runs short. Imagine you are one of the farmers. You borrowed seed grain in spring. Your contract stipulates repayment after harvest in the official 12th month. You have ripe fields before that month arrives. You harvest early, hoping to sell at high prices before the market floods. But the temples and merchant houses are watching the same calendar. They anticipated the early harvest. They flood the market with stored grain from their warehouses on the first day of what should have been the intercalary month. Prices drop 40% in a single week. You sell at a loss. When the official repayment month arrives, you cannot cover your debt with the proceeds from your devalued harvest. You forfeit your land. Over 700 families in Uma's hinterland lose their land that year. They do not starve immediately. They become sharecroppers on land they once owned, working for the temples that now hold title. But sharecropping contracts are calculated on the same calendar. The next year, without the intercalary month that should have been added, planting comes early again. You plant late by habit, following the agricultural cycle your father followed. The crop fails. This time, you sell your children. Read that again. You sell your children, not to cruelty, to calendar manipulation, to priests deciding when months begin and end, to a system where time itself is a weapon wielded by those who can read the sky. This was not an accident. This was the system working exactly as designed. The calendar creates predictable cycles of debt. Farmers borrow in spring when grain prices are high. They repay after harvest when prices are low. The interest compounds. The debt grows. Eventually, land transfers from farmers to temples, from those who work to those who calculate. And the mechanism is invisible. You do not see the priests conspiring. You see only the calendar, the dates, the months, the inexorable march of time that you cannot control. But the calendar's power goes deeper than debt. It controls your daily survival. You are a laborer in Ur, 3rd dynasty, around 2000 BCE. You work on the city walls, hauling mud bricks, stacking them under the brutal sun. Your payment is not silver. It is beer and bread, distributed monthly by temple officials. The distribution happens on the 2nd day of each month. If you are sick that day, you receive nothing. If you're assigned to distant canal projects during distribution, your ration is reduced by transport losses. The calendar determines not just when you eat, how much, based on where you happen to be when calendarically mandated distribution occurs. Think about what this means in practice. On the 2nd and 3rd day of each month, when workers have just received rations and supplies are abundant, grain merchants appear in residential districts. They offer silver for barley at depressed prices. You are desperate for silver. You need to pay for tools, for clothing, for medical treatment, for your sick daughter. You sell a portion of your monthly ration immediately. You plan to stretch the remainder across 29 days instead of 30. The same merchants reappear on the 25th and 26th day of each month. Your household stores run low. Anxiety about the final days mounts. Now they sell grain for silver at prices 30 to 40% higher than they paid 4 weeks earlier. You buy back grain at usurious rates, completing a circuit of exploitation that is perfectly legal, never violent, entirely structured by the calendar's monthly rhythm. Your mother calculates grain portions to the handful. Your children are sent to eat at other tables. You trade present survival against future vulnerability every single month. Payday lending, predatory credit cycles, the poverty trap. Different names for the same mechanism. The calendar is still the mechanism. The exploitation is still legal. The system still works. But the calendar's authority rests on a fragile foundation, the assumption that it reflects cosmic order, that the priests who maintain it possess knowledge granted by the gods, that the calculations are infallible. When they fail, the consequences ripple far beyond astronomy. 671 BCE Nineveh. The Assyrian court astronomers have predicted a total lunar eclipse for the 15th day of the 6th month. Eclipses are omens of the gravest significance. Divine warnings to the king. The specific month and day determine the meaning, whether it portends military victory or defeat, whether it threatens the king's life, whether it demands specific rituals to avert disaster. The entire machinery of state prepares. Priests assemble offerings. The king performs purification rituals. Officials postpone a military campaign scheduled for the 7th month, waiting to see whether the eclipse's omen requires adjustment of plans. On the appointed night, the royal household and hundreds of officials gather to witness the predicted event. The moon rises, full, bright, and it stays that way, all night. No shadow, no darkness, no divine omen, no eclipse. The astronomers scramble to explain. Perhaps they miscalculated the month. Perhaps the gods showed mercy and withdrew the omen. Perhaps the eclipse will occur next month instead. They check and recheck their clay tablets, their records of previous eclipses, their mathematical models of lunar cycles. They find the error, a miscounting of months in their base data from 7 years prior, compounded by subsequent calculations. But the damage is done. Think about what this means. If the astronomers cannot predict eclipses accurately, can they be trusted to maintain the calendar? If the calendar is wrong, are debt contracts calculated by that calendar legitimate? If the priests misunderstand the god's signs, is the king's authority, validated by those priests, legitimate? The king executes 2 of the senior astronomers. He replaces the head of the temple astronomical bureau. But the executions solved nothing. The error was technical, not treasonous. And every educated person in Nineveh now knows that the astronomers, the very people who determine when months begin and end, when years require intercalation, when debts come due and taxes must be paid, can make mistakes. Fundamental mistakes. Mistakes that suggest their vaunted expertise might be less divine revelation than fallible human calculation. Read that again. The people who control when you must pay, when you must work, when you must sacrifice, cannot predict the moon. Similar crises erupt periodically across the ancient Near East. A predicted planetary conjunction fails to materialize. A solemn pronouncement that the coming year will have 12 months is followed by panicked mid-year correction, adding a 13th, a festival scheduled for the new moon, when the moon stubbornly remains visible for 2 additional nights, forcing priests to admit they miscalculated the month's length. Each failure chips away at the calendar's sacred aura. Each admission of error reminds observers that behind the mystery and ritual are simply men with clay tablets and reed styluses. Men who can count and calculate and extrapolate from records, but who can also miscount and miscalculate and extrapolate incorrectly. Men whose errors become laws that govern other men's lives. The political consequences are immediate. Rival factions within royal courts begin maintaining separate astronomical observations, checking the official predictions, preparing alternative interpretations they can deploy if official astronomers fail. Some temples start keeping duplicate calendar records as insurance against official errors. Merchants who lost fortunes when unexpected intercalations disrupted carefully timed contracts begin demanding that loan agreements include provisions for calendar corrections, clauses specifying what happens if an intercalary month is added after the contract is signed but before repayment comes due. The calendar remains powerful, but it can no longer claim infallibility, and a power that acknowledges its own fallibility is a power that can be questioned, contested, negotiated with in ways that infallible divine authority cannot be. Credit default swaps, force majeure clauses, contract contingencies, modern names for ancient protection. Same principle. When the system that measures obligation proves fallible, those with resources protect themselves with legal escape hatches. By the first millennium BCE, Babylonian astronomers have developed mathematical models of extraordinary sophistication. They can predict the length of lunar months years in advance. They understand the 19-year metonic cycle. 19 solar years equal almost exactly 235 lunar months. This allows perfect regular intercalation. 7 intercalary months every 19 years. This knowledge is not public. It is preserved in cuneiform texts written in obscure technical vocabulary, copied and transmitted within scribal families who served the temples. The predictability of the calendar paradoxically increases its power as instrument of control. Rulers can plan years ahead, scheduling military campaigns, construction projects, tax collection, knowing exactly when months will be added and when debts will come due. But this same precision contains seeds of resistance. Once the calendar's patterns become predictable, they can be anticipated. Imagine you are a merchant now. You have learned to time your contracts to avoid intercalary months when interest accumulates longer. You negotiate planting schedules that give you buffer time before debt payments. When drought or locusts devastate a harvest, you appeal to precedents, recorded in archives, of kings declaring debt forgiveness tied to specific calendar dates. You invoke the calendar not as instrument of oppression, but as framework for justice. The Babylonian Chronicle documents dozens of debt amnesties proclaimed by various kings. These are always dated precisely: the month, the day, the year of the king's reign. The Chronicle does not explain motivations, but the pattern is clear. Amnesties cluster around certain events. Military victories when the king needs popular support. Succession crises when a new ruler seeks legitimacy. Natural disasters when social stability is threatened. The calendar has become a language of negotiation between rulers and ruled. A shared framework within which power is exercised and occasionally contested. Think about that. The same tool used to extract debt can be invoked to cancel debt. The same priests who decide when you owe can proclaim you are forgiven. The system that enslaves can also liberate. This is how power maintains itself, not through pure oppression, through calibrated release, through calculated mercy, through demonstrating that the system, while harsh, can also be just. You learn to wait, to endure, to hope that the next king, the next crisis, the next appeal to precedent might set you free. And most of the time, you wait in vain. But occasionally, the calendar's internal logic, the precedents, the festivals, the traditions, forces those in power to grant relief, not from goodness, from necessity. Because a system that never forgives creates populations with nothing to lose. The Neo-Assyrian Empire in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE faces a persistent problem. Different regions use different calendars. Babylonians in the south use a lunar calendar with Sumerian month names. Arameans in the west use a different lunar calendar with Semitic month names. Egyptians use a solar calendar of 12 30-day months plus 5 intercalary days. days. Coordinating administration across this patchwork requires either imposing a single calendar, risking rebellion in regions attached to their traditional systems, or maintaining parallel calendars and constantly translating dates between them. The Assyrians choose pragmatic solution. They allow local calendars to persist, but they require all official documents sent to the capital to include both the local date and the corresponding date in the Assyrian calendar. This creates enormous bureaucratic burden. Scribes must be trained in multiple calendar systems. Errors in translation are common, but it also creates opportunities. Local elites who master calendar conversion position themselves as essential intermediaries between their communities and the imperial administration. They control access to the temporal frameworks that determine when taxes are due, when troops must be mustered, when subject peoples can appeal to the king for redress. The pattern repeats today. Tax codes with different fiscal years for different entities. Accounting standards that vary by jurisdiction. Financial reporting calendars that create arbitrage opportunities for those who understand the gaps. The calendar is still power. Those who master its complexities still profit. The Achaemenid Persian Empire imposes a standardized administrative calendar while allowing religious calendars to continue locally. This bifurcation breaks the priestly monopoly. Tax collection, military mobilization, and imperial administration operate on a solar calendar published years in advance. But religious life, festivals, sacrifices, ritual observances continues on traditional lunar calendars. This rationalization creates new problems. Administrative dates drift out of sync with agricultural reality. You are forced to deliver taxes before harvests complete, to muster for military service during planting season, to observe religious festivals that fall on workdays according to the civil calendar. You live in two temporal frameworks simultaneously, one sacred, one secular, neither quite matching the rhythm of the land you work. Medieval Islam faces the same tension. The purely lunar Hijri calendar, unconnected to the solar year, serves religious purposes. Ramadan drifts through the seasons, rotating completely around the solar year every 33 years. You are a farmer in 9th century Iraq. You need a solar calendar to know when to plant. But religious scholars insist on the sanctity of the purely lunar calendar ordained by the prophet. The result is bifurcated system. Religious calendar governs ritual. Solar calendar governs agriculture and taxation. You track both. You celebrate Eid al-Fitr when the lunar calendar dictates. You plant barley when the solar calendar permits. You pay taxes on dates determined by administrators following neither calendar but their own fiscal logic. Christian Europe repeats the pattern. The ecclesiastical calendar determines Easter and movable feasts through complex lunar calculations. The civil calendar determines when rents are due and markets are held, following the solar year. The two are never quite synchronized. You owe obligations on dates determined by both calendars. You attend festivals on days calculated by lunar cycles. You face harvest deadlines measured by solar time. The calendar, as in ancient Mesopotamia, remains an instrument through which landlords, kings, and churches extract labor, wealth, and obedience. What makes this possible is fundamental asymmetry of knowledge and power. Those who control the calendar possess information unavailable to those who live by it. They know when intercalary months will be added. They know when debts will come due. They know when labor will be demanded and when rest will be permitted. This knowledge is technical, requiring literacy, numeracy, access to archived records. It is also sacred, cloaked in religious authority and astronomical mystery. And it is juridical, embedded in contracts and laws that assume the calendar as unchallengeable given. But the calendar's power is never absolute. It can be anticipated, negotiated, occasionally resisted. You learn to read the sky yourself, to predict when intercalation is likely, to time your loans accordingly. Merchants develop informal networks for sharing calendar information, giving them advantages in trade and credit. And when the calendar's demands become too onerous, when too many have fallen into debt, when labor obligations prevent adequate planting, when ration distributions fail to prevent hunger, you appeal to kings for relief. And kings, needing compliant populations, periodically grant it. The calendar is a technology of negotiation as much as domination. It creates the temporal framework within which ancient Near Eastern societies organize production, distribution, and obligation. It gives rulers powerful tools for extracting resources and mobilizing labor. But it also creates expectations, precedents, rhythms that you internalize and can invoke in your own defense. The Misharim edicts that cancel debts. The intercalary months that give you extra time. The festival distributions that feed your hungry children. These are not gifts from benevolent kings. They are concessions extracted through the same calendar system that enables exploitation in the first place. And so you, the farmer who stood before the scribe in 1678 BCE, watching your debt recorded on clay, are not merely victim, you are participant in vast social negotiation mediated by the calendar. You cannot read the tablet, but you know its contents. You cannot calculate the interest, but you can count moons. You cannot change the date your debt comes due, but you know that if enough farmers face the same crisis, the king might proclaim Misharim, might cancel the debts, might restore what the calendar has taken away. You keep watching the sky, tracking the moons, waiting for the moment when the system that binds you might set you free. Beer rations distributed to Earth-3 workers are not luxuries. They are nutritional staples. Distribution follows strict monthly schedules. You are sick on distribution day, you receive nothing. You are assigned to distant canal projects during distribution. Your ration is reduced by transport losses. The calendar determines not just when you eat, how much, based on administrative convenience that has nothing to do with your hunger. The calendar also structures religious life in ways that reinforce social hierarchy. Mesopotamian religion recognizes dozens of festivals throughout the year, each associated with specific gods, requiring specific offerings. But not all festivals are equal. Some are state occasions involving the entire population. Others are exclusive rituals performed by priests for elite audiences. The timing of these festivals is determined by the calendar, announced by temple officials. You cannot independently verify when a festival should occur. You depend on priests to inform you when the gods require celebration, when work must cease for ritual observance, when offerings must be made. This dependence creates opportunities for manipulation. During political upheaval or economic crisis, festivals might be postponed or canceled, their dates adjusted to suit administrative convenience. When rival cities compete for regional dominance, each might claim authority to determine the proper calendar, leading to situations where the same festival is celebrated on different dates in different cities. each claiming divine sanction for its version of time. The calendar becomes weapon in political struggles. Control over its maintenance, a mark of legitimacy and power. A court case from Old Babylonian period illustrates this. Two merchants dispute the terms of a grain loan. One claims the contract specified repayment in the 12th month. The other insists it said the harvest month, which, due to unexpected intercalation, turned out to be the 13th. The surviving tablet records the judge's ruling. The debt is due when the harvest occurs, regardless of which month number that happens to be. The agricultural reality takes precedence over calendrical precision. The ruling suggests that calendar dates, while powerful, are not absolute. They can be contested in courts, reinterpreted through appeal to agricultural necessity, overridden when their application becomes socially or economically destabilizing. The calendar provides framework for agreements, but enforcement depends on human judgment about when adhering to calendrical precision serves justice and when it creates injustice. Such flexibility is essential. The ancient Near East is environmentally unstable. Drought delays planting by weeks. Floods destroy crops. Locusts devastate entire regions in days. A rigid calendar that insists on fixed dates for debt repayment or tax collection, regardless of these realities, would generate constant crises. Instead, the system incorporates escape valves. The possibility of royal amnesties, judicial extensions, renegotiated contracts. These escape valves are themselves calendrically structured. Amnesties are proclaimed on specific festival days. Extensions follow standard formulas measured in months. Even exceptions to the calendar follow calendrical logic. Think about that. Even mercy is scheduled. Even forgiveness follows the calendar. There is no escape from time, only negotiation within its framework. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, a class of independent merchants has emerged. Neither priests nor royal officials, but they have somehow acquired functional calendar literacy. They cannot perform complex astronomical calculations required to predict intercalations years in advance. But they have learned to recognize patterns. They know that intercalary months tend to cluster in certain years within the 19-year cycle. They know which star risings the priests watch. They can make educated guesses about when a 13th month is likely. This partial knowledge is enough to build fortunes. Imagine you are one of these merchants. You correctly anticipate an intercalary year. You time your grain purchases to perfection, buying when everyone expects 12 months of consumption, selling when 13 months of scarcity hits the market. The profits from a single well-timed speculation exceed what a farmer earns in a decade of labor. More subtly, you learn to structure debt contracts in ways that exploit calendar ambiguities. A contract might specify repayment in the 12th month, without clarifying whether this means the 12th month of a 12-month year or the 12th month of a 13-month year, a distinction that makes no difference in a 12-month year, but could mean an extra month of accumulated interest if intercalation occurs. Illiterate borrowers agree to such contracts without understanding the embedded option you have purchased. When disputes arise, you cite precedents from archived tablets. You point to ambiguous language in contracts. You argue interpretations of calendar terminology that favor your interests. You develop relationships with scribes, not the high priests who maintain the official calendar. The numerous lower-level scribes who write contracts and maintain records. A merchant who regularly employs a particular scribe, who pays well and treats him with respect, might find that scribe's memory of verbal agreements surprisingly favorable when disputes reach courts. Legal arbitrage, regulatory complexity, good lawyers. The same principle dressed in modern language. Same principle. Those who understand the system's intricacies profit from those who do not. The system begins to fracture from within. Once calendar knowledge spreads beyond the priesthood, even imperfectly, the sacred mystery that protected it begins to dissolve. Farmers learn to ask merchants about expected intercalations before signing loan contracts. Laborers begin comparing notes about which months are typically longest, planning their private economic activities accordingly. The calendar remains powerful, but it ceases to be entirely opaque. This creates new dynamic. Priests and officials can no longer manipulate the calendar with complete impunity. Too drastic a departure from expected patterns will be noticed by merchants, will disrupt trade, will generate complaints from economically sophisticated actors who have resources to make their grievances heard. The calendar's power becomes dependent on maintaining degree of predictability, on following precedents closely enough that those who have learned the patterns can still rely on them. This paradox, a system simultaneously rigid and flexible, deterministic and negotiable, is the key to the calendar's enduring power. It is rigid enough to coordinate large-scale economic activity and extract predictable surpluses. It is flexible enough to accommodate environmental variability and social pressure. It is sacred enough to resist casual manipulation. It is technical enough to require specialized expertise. It is public enough that everyone knows the current month and year. It is esoteric enough that predicting future intercalations remains priestly mystery. When the system finally breaks down, it is not because you reject it. It is because new forms of power emerge that do not require it. The rise of coined money, beginning in 7th century BCE in Anatolia and spreading gradually across the Near East, creates alternative ways to measure debt and obligation. Unlike grain loans measured in months and repaid at harvest, silver loans can be denominated in weight and repaid at any time. The calendar still matters for tax collection and religious festivals, but it ceases to be the primary framework for managing credit. The spread of alphabetic literacy reduces the monopoly that specialized scribes hold over calendar knowledge. A cuneiform calendar requires years of training to read and maintain. An alphabetic calendar can be learned in months. As literacy spreads beyond elite scribal families, calendar knowledge becomes more accessible. These changes do not happen quickly. For centuries, the old system and the new coexist. Cuneiform astronomical tablets are still being written in Babylon in the 1st century CE. More than 3 centuries after Babylon fell under Greek and Roman rule. The last cuneiform astronomers are maintaining a tradition reaching back nearly 3,000 years, tracking lunar cycles according to methods developed in the 3rd millennium BCE. The final cuneiform tablet recording astronomical observations is written in 75 CE. After that, silence. The last astronomers who could read the ancient records die. The last scribes who knew how to maintain the lunar calendar pass away. The temples that house them are abandoned or converted to other uses. The clay tablets that documented millennia of celestial observations are buried under shifting sands and rising ground levels. forgotten for nearly 2,000 years until archaeologists began excavating Mesopotamian sites in the 19th century. But the principle survives. Controlling time means controlling people. The calendar's no longer carved in clay. It is coded in software. It determines when your mortgage payment is due, when interest compounds, when your contract renews, when the fiscal quarter ends, when your credit card billing cycle closes. You still cannot verify the calculations. You still depend on authorities you cannot see. The scribe has been replaced by the algorithm, the clay tablet by the database, the temple by the corporation. But you still stand before the authority that controls time, and the calendar still says you owe. Think about that. Credit card companies time their billing cycles to maximize late fees. They know most people pay near the end of the month, so they make payment due dates fall on weekends or holidays when processing delays. Entirely legal, entirely calculated, entirely about manipulating time to extract wealth. Employers schedule paychecks bi-weekly instead of monthly, creating predictable cash flow gaps that drive workers to payday lenders, who charge 300% annual interest for 2-week loans. The calendar creates the crisis. The lenders profit from it. Tax filing deadlines, student loan payment schedules, mortgage amortization tables. These are not neutral frameworks. They are instruments of control. Designed by those who understand calendar mechanics, imposed on those who do not. The farmer in 1678 BCE watched the scribe seal the clay. He could not read what was written, but he knew what it meant. 3,000 years later, we watch screens display our due dates. We can read the numbers, but do we understand the system any better than he did? We know when our payments are due, but do we know why the billing cycle is 28 days instead of 30? Why interest compounds daily instead of monthly? Why the fiscal year ends in April instead of December? We trust the calendar because we have no choice, because the alternative is to be excluded from economic life entirely, because challenging the calendar means challenging the entire framework of debt, obligation, and exchange. The calendar was never about measuring time. It was always about measuring power. And that has not changed at all. 1678 BCE, you watch the scribe press his seal into wet clay. Your debt is recorded, your land forfeit, but you will keep watching the sky, tracking the moons, counting the days, waiting for the moment, the king's proclamation, the festival amnesty, the harvest windfall, when the calendar that enslaves you might set you free, because the system that controls you also contains the possibility of liberation, not through your rebellion, through its own internal logic, its precedents, its rhythms, its occasional, calculated mercy. You cannot break the calendar, but you can wait for it to break in your favor. And sometimes, if you are patient, if you are lucky, if enough others share your crisis, it does. The clay hardens, the debt is permanent, but time keeps moving. Moons wax and wane, seasons turn, and in that movement, in that endless cycle, there is always the possibility that the next moon, the next harvest, the next proclamation will be different. But let's go deeper. Because the calendar's power did not stop at debt and labor. It controlled something more fundamental: marriage, childbirth, death itself. Imagine you are a woman in Babylon, 1800 BCE. Your wedding date is not chosen by you or your family. It is determined by the calendar. Certain months are auspicious for marriage. Others are forbidden. The priests consult astronomical tablets. They declare that marriages contracted in the 6th month will be blessed by Ishtar. Marriages in the 9th month will be cursed. Your family arranges your marriage. But they must wait for the auspicious month. 4 months pass. You remain unmarried. Your betrothed grows impatient. His family questions whether your family is honoring the agreement. Finally, the 6th month arrives. The wedding proceeds. The contract is signed, witnessed, sealed with temple approval. 3 months later, you are pregnant. The child is due in the 3rd month. But the midwife warns that births in the 3rd month are unlucky. She recommends delaying the birth if possible. Herbs that might slow labor. Rituals that might postpone delivery. You refuse. Your body has its own rhythm. The calendar cannot control when your child comes, but it can control what happens after. Your son is born in the 3rd month. The temple records his birth on a clay tablet. The date becomes part of his identity, his legal existence, his relationship to the calendar that will govern his entire life. When he comes of age, when he seeks employment, when he contracts marriage, when he borrows grain, the month of his birth will be consulted. Certain months produce workers suitable for temple service. Others produce farmers. Others produce soldiers. Your son, born in the 3rd month, is marked from birth as suitable for manual labor, not scribal training, not priestly service, manual labor. The calendar has determined his fate before he can speak. Read that again. The month of your birth determines your economic future, not your ability, not your merit. The position of the moon on the night you emerged from your mother's womb. This seems like superstition, ancient ignorance. But look at modern astrology. Look at how job applications ask for birth dates. Look at how credit scores track from age 18. The calendar still marks us from birth, still categorizes us, still limits us. The mechanism has changed. The principle endures. Death, too, is calendarically controlled. In Mesopotamian belief, certain days are favorable for funerals. Others are catastrophically unlucky. Your father dies on the 28th day of the month. An unlucky day. The priests declare that burial must be postponed until the 3rd day of the next month. 5 days. In the heat of Mesopotamian summer. Your father's body decomposing in your home. The smell becoming unbearable. The health risk mounting. But the calendar says you must wait. If you bury him on an unlucky day, his spirit will wander. Unable to rest in the underworld. Your family will be cursed. The fields will fail. Your children will die young. So you wait. 5 days of horror. Because the calendar says so. We call it waiting periods today. We call it bureaucratic delays. We call it processing time. Your loved one is dead, but you cannot bury them until the proper forms are filed, the proper authorities notified, the proper fees paid. The calendar still controls death, still imposes waiting, still extracts its price even in grief. But the calendar also created something unexpected: solidarity. When everyone lives under the same temporal framework, experiences the same monthly ration anxieties, faces the same harvest deadlines, celebrates the same festivals, a shared consciousness emerges. You are not just a farmer. You are one of thousands of farmers who all know that the 9th month is when debts typically come due, who all watch the sky for signs of intercalation, who all hope for the same royal proclamation of debt forgiveness. This creates possibility for collective action. 2115 BCE, The city of Lagash. A severe drought has devastated crops for 2 consecutive years. Farmers cannot repay debts. The temples begin foreclosing on land at unprecedented rates. But the farmers notice a pattern. The foreclosures are all scheduled for the same week, the second week of the 10th month. A calendarically mandated deadline when multiple debt contracts mature simultaneously. Instead of facing foreclosure individually, scattered across months, they face it together, all at once. 3,000 farmers converge on the temple complex during the foreclosure week. They do not riot. They do not attack. They simply stand in the courtyard, silently, blocking access to the administrative offices where foreclosure contracts would be processed. The temple officials cannot proceed, cannot execute foreclosures on thousands of families simultaneously without massive violence, cannot maintain the fiction that this is orderly legal process rather than mass dispossession. The king, fearing rebellion, intervenes. He proclaims debt forgiveness, not from mercy, from pragmatic calculation that foreclosing on 3,000 families at once would destabilize the entire region. The farmers win, not through rebellion, through calendar literacy, through recognizing that the system that enslaves them also creates concentrated moments of vulnerability where collective presence can force concessions. We see this today. Tax day protests, mortgage payment strikes, rent freezes. When many people face the same calendarically imposed crisis simultaneously, individual powerlessness can transform into collective leverage. The calendar that controls can also coordinate resistance. Think about that. The same tool used to extract debt can be used to organize debtors. The same temporal framework that imposes obligations can highlight the moment to refuse those obligations collectively. But such moments are rare. Most of the time, the calendar simply grinds on, extracting, controlling, organizing life into predictable rhythms of obligation and submission. You're a child in Uruk, 2500 BCE. You have never known life without the calendar. Your earliest memories are of your mother counting moons, of your father calculating planting dates, of festival days when work stopped and food appeared. You do not question the calendar. It is simply how time works, how the world is organized, how the gods have structured reality. This is the calendar's deepest power, not force, naturalization. By the time you're old enough to question whether the calendar serves your interests, you have already internalized its rhythm so completely that questioning seems absurd. Like questioning whether the sun rises, whether water flows downhill, whether crops need seasons. The calendar is not imposed from outside. It is woven into the fabric of your consciousness, your planning, your sense of past and future. You cannot imagine life without it, even if you understand intellectually that it serves the powerful more than it serves you. This is how the system perpetuates itself, not through constant enforcement, through making alternatives unthinkable. We experience this today. Try to imagine living without calendars, without scheduled payments, without deadlines, without fiscal years. You cannot. The calendar has become how you think about time itself. Questioning it feels like questioning reality. That is its victory. Complete, total, invisible. The priests of Mesopotamia understood this intuitively. They did not need to guard the calendar with violence. They needed to make it indispensable, to ensure that every aspect of life, economic, religious, agricultural, legal, ran according to calendrical logic. Once that happened, The calendar defended itself. Anyone who challenged it was not fighting priests. They were fighting the entire structure of society, fighting the framework that made trade possible, that coordinated harvests, that scheduled festivals, that measured all obligation, fighting time itself. And time, as the priest knew, always wins. But the priest also knew that time is not natural. It is constructed. The calendar is a human invention, maintained by human labor, vulnerable to human error. Every intercalation decision is political. Every month-length calculation is subject to manipulation. Every festival date is negotiable. The priest's power rested on hiding this flexibility, on presenting calendar as cosmic necessity rather than administrative choice. When failures like the Nineveh eclipse exposed that flexibility, when merchants learned to anticipate intercalations, when farmers began questioning why the harvest month arrived early, the calendar's sacred aura cracked, not enough to shatter it, but enough to show the mechanisms beneath. The fallible humans, the political calculations, the negotiated compromises. And once you see those mechanisms, you can never quite unsee them. The farmer in 1678 BCE probably did not understand the astronomical calculations behind the calendar, but he understood power. He understood that someone decided when his debt came due, someone who benefited from that decision. That knowledge was not enough to free him, but it was enough to teach him to watch, to wait, to recognize that the system, which seemed eternal and unchangeable, was actually maintained by people. People who made mistakes, people who could be pressured, people who occasionally, under the right circumstances, could be forced to grant mercy. The calendar controlled him, but he was not entirely helpless within that control. He could learn its rhythms, anticipate its demands, occasionally navigate its complexities to his advantage. More often, he simply endured. But endurance is not nothing. Survival is not nothing. And in rare moments, when enough farmers shared his crisis, when the harvest failed too dramatically to ignore, when the king needed popular support more than he needed debt collection, survival became liberation. Temporary, conditional, calendrically bounded, but real. The Misharum edict that canceled his debt would itself be dated, proclaimed on a specific festival day, effective until the next king's reign began, measured in months and years according to the same calendar that had created his debt in the first place. Even freedom operated within the calendar's framework. There was no escape from time, only negotiation within its structures. Only moments of relief within its relentless march. The tablet was sealed, the debt recorded. But the farmer kept watching the sky, because the calendar that imprisoned him was also the language in which freedom might be spoken, the framework within which justice might be proclaimed, the system that, while usually crushing him, occasionally contained the possibility of mercy. Not because the system was just, because the system required enough people to survive to continue functioning. The calendar's power depended on populations large enough to work the fields, pay the taxes, maintain the canals, staff the armies. If too many died in debt, if too many families disintegrated, if too many fled to the marshes or the mountains, the system collapsed. So the calendar incorporated its own corrections, its own release valves, its own moments of forgiveness, not from compassion, from systemic necessity. The farmer understood this instinctively. He did not expect justice. He expected calculation. The king would grant debt relief when keeping the population viable served the king's interest. That was enough, because systemic necessity, while cold, was at least predictable, calculable, sometimes anticipatable. The calendar that measured obligation could also measure hope, could mark the approach of festivals when amnesties might be proclaimed, could count down to the end of kings' reigns when new rulers might seek legitimacy through debt forgiveness. Time enslaved, but time also, occasionally, liberated. The farmer waited, counted moons, watched for signs, and sometimes, not often, but sometimes, the calendar delivered, not freedom, but reprieve. Not justice, but mercy. Not equality, but survival. Under the calendar's shadow, in the system's grip, making do with what the framework allowed. That was life in the ancient Near East. That was life under calendrical control. That, if we are honest, is still life today. The mechanisms have changed. The principle endures. The calendar controls you. But you are still here, still watching, still counting, still waiting. That is not victory. But it is not quite defeat either. It is survival, under the calendar's shadow, in the system's grip, hoping that time itself, the very thing that enslaves you, might eventually deliver justice, or at least mercy, or at least another day. 1678 BCE, 75 CE, 2026 CE, 3,700 years. Different calendars, different technologies, different names for the same mechanisms, but the farmer still stands before the authority that controls time. The debt is still recorded, the payment is still due, and the calendar still says you owe. Time is power, time is control, time is the invisible prison we all inhabit. The Mesopotamians understood this. They built an entire civilization on it. We have inherited that civilization, those structures, that logic. We just stopped noticing. The calendar won. Not through violence, through becoming invisible, through becoming inevitable, through becoming what we call reality itself. And that is the most terrifying thing of all. Not that we are controlled by the calendar, but that we cannot imagine being free from it